Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started. Thank you for being here so bright and early. So, guy behind the screen over there, I know you said, yes, we're good. All right, to wave when we're starting. Thank you so much for coming this morning, getting out of bed to come to this Taking Work to Bed session. We're going to talk about how gay service providers incorporate emerging HIV knowledge into our professional and personal lives. So shit's going to get real this morning. We're going to talk about like real stuff, like what actually happens in our lives and in our work, which is very exciting. So I'm going to start by getting everyone to introduce themselves. Maybe Roberto, you can start.
Yeah, my name is Roberto. I am the executive director at Max Arwa. I used to work at Réseau in Montreal before. I come from Mexico. I'm a gay guy. I use he, him pronouns. And I started working in the field almost 10 years ago as an outreach worker, going to bathhouses and doing online coaching, peer coaching. So I've been around in the field taking work to bed for 10 years.
Hi everyone, I'm Len Tooley. I use he, his pronouns. I'm the manager of research and evaluation at CBRC. I just moved to Vancouver from Toronto, where I lived for about 18 years, and couple of the things that I had done that were sort of relevant. I was an HIV tester for 10 years in Toronto's bathhouses, mostly in spa access in Toronto. And about, 5 years ago, I was an early sort of adopter of PrEP. And so that sort of informed some of my perspectives to coming to the work, and I'm sure I'll talk a little bit more about that at some point.
Great, thank you. And my name is Marc-André LeBlanc. I live in Gatineau, which, as I like to say, is Ottawa adjacent. And I've been working in the field for over 25 years. In the last 15 years, a lot of it was focused around advocacy for the development of new prevention options, such as PrEP, treatment as prevention, microbicides, vaccines. So I think as a lot of us had privileged access to very early information on all of these things as they were being developed, because I was advocating for them and doing a lot of training to service providers about all of these new options that were coming down the pipeline. And I remember waving the flag, prepare yourselves, these are coming, prepare yourselves. And here we are, they're here. And like Len, I was also, I would say, a pretty early adopter of PrEP during the seasons of risk, as one of the researchers likes to call it. So we're going to get started. All of us actually work together on a project called the Resonance Project, which I'll describe. And the sort of springboard for our discussion today is going to be this project. So just a bit of an overview. So we're going to discuss briefly some of the findings from this theme of this dual role of being gay men and service providers working in this field with gay men at the same time. And then we'll have a bit of a discussion. We'll see how it goes. We're going to try to replicate some of the conversations that we had as we were grappling with the findings of this project. And we're going to have quite a bit of time for us to have a discussion with all of you, because we're really curious to hear if any of this is resonating with you. Haha, see what we did there? All right. So here's some of the goals that we had for this presentation. We wanted to encourage self-reflexivity among us working in this field on the intersection with our personal and professional lives. So to think about some of the complicated ways that our identities are tied up in our work, our professional and personal identities, and sharing some of the thoughts about that. Contextualize some of our experiences of working in the field and how it fits in also into sort of a broader context of how we've kind of always done this since the beginning of the field, given that we work within our own communities a lot of the time, and how we've kind of also in our role as educators and service providers played sort of that goal of mediators between some of that biomedical information and public health in our communities. So a bit about the Resonance Project. It was a national community-based research project. It was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. It ran from 2013 to 2016. And I just want to highlight that we did a lot of our data collection around 2014, if I remember correctly, end of 2014, beginning of 2015, or is it end of 13, beginning of 14?
End of 13.
Right. So I just want to point that out because it is important. Because it was really while the field was shifting seemingly every single month. While we were doing this data collection, it seemed like on a monthly basis there was a new groundbreaking finding from a large study or clinical trial. So just to put it in context, when we did this, we did have the results from from IPREX among gay men and 2 trials among heterosexual men and women. But we didn't yet have hyper-gay, we didn't yet have PROUD, so in terms of PrEP. PrEP had only been approved in the US, was the only country it was approved at the time, and it had only been so for about a year and a half. We had the preliminary results from HPTN-052. You may all remember that when we found out that being on treatment versus not being on treatment, if you're positive, reduced the risk of transmitting HIV. But we didn't even have the data about undetectability at that time from that study, and we certainly didn't have the partners and opposites attract studies. So, but it was in flux. Some of these findings came out literally a month or 2 after we had done our data collection. So I just want to put it in the context of where we as sort of gay service providers were sitting in there hearing this information and maybe wasn't yet out in the community. Anyways, we'll come back to that in our conversations. So here you see our team members. There were national organizations involved as well as local gay men's health organizations. The co-principal investigators were Ed Jackson, who then worked at Katie, and Barry Adam from the University of Windsor. I worked on the project as one of the project staff members along with Sam Patton. Right, that's all I'll say about that. So I've already talked about this, actually, the background of how much things have shifted, and we wanted to hear what guys were saying about all of this. Viral load, acute infection, pre-exposure prophylaxis, post-exposure prophylaxis, sexually transmitted infections overall. And we wanted to understand sort of the cultural resonance, which is why the title of the project, all of this information had for gay men who remain the most affected community by HIV in Canada, and understand how this information translated into decisions that guys made about how they connected with each other, how they incorporated it into their lives or not, how they communicate with each other, which was really the emphasis. We wanted to hear how guys talk to each other about this, which is why we, as you'll see, did mostly focus groups and just let guys talk about this, and we listened very intently. And wanted to understand the role that service providers played in this context as well. We did it among gay men, not just because it was the most affected community, but also because we knew that with all of this emerging information, gay men, we know, are early adopters of many, many things, not just HIV prevention information. You know, smartphones came out, and about 15 minutes later, we figured out how we could use the GPS function to connect to each other. I love how in recent years, like the straight was like, ooh, Tinder, this is great. It's like, yeah, we figured that out a while back. So we thought if anyone is going to be taking up this information and figuring out really creative and innovative ways of integrating it into our lives, it was probably going to be gay men. So that's why we wanted to look there. So these are the project objectives. We wanted to see how gay men are taking up this information, if it has resonance in their daily lives, how they talk about this, and how service providers shape some of this discourse happening in the community. Just some definitions of resonance. That was the sort of concept that we went with about waves of discourse generated by new information and incorporating into new community wisdom. So we collected information from 4 specific groups of gay men. Gay men who were connected to HIV organizations, gay men in serodiscordant relationships, whether they were positive or negative, sexually active HIV positive gay men and HIV negative gay men that we deemed at quote unquote high risk. And we had some measures to try to get to some approximations of that. And we assumed that those specific groups might be the earliest adopters in there. They might be the ones applying this information the earliest into their own lives because it would have particular relevance, or they were in most need of this information because of their situation. So we had focus groups with each of these 4 subgroups in the 3 cities of Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. It'll be interesting to hear, particularly if you're outside of those cities, again, if these findings have resonance for you. And we did a number of follow-up interviews with service providers. We also did a focus group in each of the 3 cities, and we did interviews in particular with service providers who themselves identified as being gay men, and we did some follow-up interviews. And what we're going to present is specifically from that data, where we asked them specific questions about that dual role or that dual position. So yes, so that's what these findings are. And I'll just give you a sense of what the themes were overall, and then Roberto and Len will give you a sense of what those themes were. So there were 4 overall that emerged. First, the difficulties that some gay service providers have in separating their personal and professional lives. A lot of people talked about that. The impact on the level of fear about HIV and the impact on their own behaviors, being privy to some of this information and working in this field. Third, how gay service providers talk about HIV risk and prevention to their clients versus how they talk about it to their friends versus how they talk about it to their own sexual partners, and whether that was the same across the board or if there were differences, and if so, what are the differences? And finally, for some, the types of information or knowledge that they had, they were sort of conflicted about how much they could share in a professional capacity, and contrasting how they would talk about it in terms of real talk with their friends. But also, wrapped up in that was about being a member of the community in which you work and how much that influences your own perspectives, that sort of insider subjectivity perspective and not objectivity. So with that, I'll hand it over to Roberto.
So one of the challenges that were discussed by guys who identified as gay men and service providers was that difficulty of disconnecting work from personal life. So how to separate those. And we're going to start by hearing what they said, and we're going to keep the discussion going for the rest of the morning. So one of the guys said, I had sex with this guy, and then you cannot just no, I'm not going to give out any information. Yes, it's unintentional, but I still do it anyway. I struggled with that for a few years of working in this field. Then the next one says, it's a small world. I can't go out in my own city without seeing one of my clients somewhere. Turning on Grindr. In another city, I can go crazy and be up on a stage, twirling my shirt around and not give a fuck. I am and can be a professional, but I can also be a gay man in my 20s, living my life to the fullest. Those lines cross a lot. So as you can see, and especially in this case, this young guy trying as well to discover his sexuality and exploring, having fun. So how that interferes with a perception of having to appear seem professional, and how might that look like if you're working in the field. So this is how he perceived it, because there's different perceptions of what professional could be in the work that we do.
Roberto.
Yes.
Could you just explain also the codes on the bottom there?
Yes.
Or maybe Marc-André.
So yeah, do you wanna? So all of the ones we'll see will say in French "int," in English is SP, service providers, because all of these information are from the focus groups or the interviews made with intervenants or service providers. After that, we see the age range, followed by.
That's the sector within which they work. So OC en français, c'est organisme communautaire, organisme de santé des hommes gays. In English, what are they? I can't read my-
CBO, we have CBO.
Yeah, community-based organization. I think public health, gay men's health
Gay men's health
organization.
organization,
Some of them were counselors or psychologists.
Nurse.
Yeah, there might have been some nurses, yes. I think that's it. So those are the codes. And then the city, Montreal, Toronto,
Yeah.
or Vancouver.
Thanks, Len. So the next one. People hold us to a certain standard. Sometimes they forget that we too are just gay men that want to fuck. I mean, I'm no saint. I'm not perfect when it comes to condom usage or 100% adherence. I can make mistakes. I can be under the influence. All the things that are factors for the people that I work with are factors for me as well. I hate being held up to this golden standard and then sometimes the disappointment people might have when this standard wasn't upheld. So again, this comes of what the standards of what we preach as service providers are also the same difficulties or challenges that we live in our same lives, and the influence that we might have on emotionally or by substances are things as service providers we are living as well. The last one from Toronto. We had a frontline worker who stood up at a conference and said, "I'm positive, I party, and I bareback." A lot of people were applauding as opposed to confronting it at all. It was just a reaction that really freaked me out. This is somebody who was doing outreach work at an AIDS service organization. They were very, very cavalier about it. But then everybody's kind of silent for whatever reason to not say, well, let's talk about that. What you just said might be okay for you, but as a worker, is it okay to give those messages? I mean, what I do in my personal life is my personal life, but what I have to do in my professional life is my professional life. I have to be very careful. I'm accountable to a higher whatever right because of our position here. So through these quotes, this one in particular, we see a push and pull between personal and professional. And the fact that how hard it is to disentangle them, and how we feel that some of our personal flaws should not be shown during our professional work. For some, for others, they're struggling, and I think, is there a place for my personal difficulties or challenges to bring them to the professional work? So the next theme is the impact on fear and behaviors. Because for some gay service providers, the stress and the fear increased as they were working in the field or exposed with more information, while for others it was the inverse. Like as they were having access to more and more accurate information, that fear and concerns decreased. So there was like very different perceptions and reactions to this close relationship with the information. In the beginning, I was more panicky, getting notices from public health about a rise in LGBT or things like that. It's a lot of information to absorb, and I was young in the community. Later on, I think I had the opposite effect. There's no much that impresses me anymore. Okay, it's like, what else? It's about finding the balance between safety, health, information, and pleasure. And then the next one, knowledge is power. I just feel more safe because I know that I'm fully aware of most of the consequences of my actions. I'm much more relaxed about the issue of risk. At the least, I would say that I take more risks, but in reality, it's just that I calculate a bit more. So the information that guys were using to navigate their own risk as gay service providers was influenced by the information that they would have, and the information from academia, but I could add as well the information or the experience that they have from other users coming to see them to talk and mitigate risk. So like this last quote, this guy he says, it might be considered that what I'm doing is more risk, but in reality I just know how to calculate it better, and I feel more comfortable with the risks I'm taking. So we don't know objectively whether the behavior changed and was it really more risk or not. Like, we don't know the details about this person, but it's how this person was navigating risk and how more comfortable or stress-free the person was feeling when taking some of the risks.
Can I just jump in and,
Yeah,
and add
please
something
go.
about that? I just really want to highlight that it isn't, that it's about the access to the information and understanding what the potential consequences are that create this sense of security and being at peace with whatever risk there is. So it's not necessarily the risk reduction strategies themselves, but it's about being informed and understanding what the consequences are, which I think is an important thing to consider when we do the work. Like, it isn't in this case the particular strategy that they're using, but it's just, I feel informed, I have the information, and I'm making my decision based on that, and that's what makes me okay with my decision.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk a bit later, but one of the best examples in that sense is undetectability, because the information, scientific information, comes from, the U equals U, it's recent, but the undetectability information comes from way even before resonance, right? So some of the first statements. So, still in fear and behaviors. I used to have a lot of fuck buddies, and then when I started doing HIV work, I lost them all. I think that was the anxiety and the fear of sex. I had no interest in sex, and I viewed sex as lethal. Yeah, a deadly thing. I like to think that my own personal and sexual life is enriched because of the work that I do. I can make a lot more informed decisions. So again, here we can see those two ways of incorporating or reactions to interpersonal lives of the work that we do professionally. So the first one really is a lot more stressed, and there's a degree of anxiety that comes to these work that we're doing, whereas the other one, it's the security that Marc-André was saying before.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, one thing that is standing out to me that I think is interesting too is, like, through the quotes, I'm seeing like a process happening, right? Like, there's really active processing. Like, I used to have a lot of, like, I think that was the anxiety. Mm-hmm. So, I think that's, we'll get into it more, but that's one of these examples of how the processing is still happening sort of in real time as people are thinking about, like, being, held accountable to the work they do.
And I'll be curious to hear later from people, but that was certainly my process, like starting with that quote and going to that quote some years later, right? And the last one on fear and behaviors. So I'm reading that one up there first. I would 100% like to have access to PrEP. It's kind of a love-hate relationship with my own job. I'm working very hard on making sure to help my clients, but at the same time, I'd like to have a piece of that pie. I'd love to be a Truvada whore. Before, I always had a belief that I probably prefer not to sleep with someone who is known HIV positive. Since working in the field, that belief has completely been squashed. I don't choose my sexual partners based on their HIV status anymore. So again, being very close to accurate and reliable information helps with the security of the decisions being made of who to have sex with, or who to have relationships with just in general. And as we were saying, and this is some of the interesting things that also were observed in the difference within the cities back at that time, it was really in Montreal that there were a lot more conversations around PrEP because of the Hypergay trial happening. So there were a lot more guys already on PrEP. So this service provider who was working and knew a lot of guys being already on PrEP had like a lot more information around it and wanted to be wanted a piece of that pie and be a Truvada whore.
Great, thank you, Roberto. So another question that we had was just, or that came out, another theme that came out was how there could be differences between what someone might say to like a client if they were doing outreach, what kind of information they might give, and what information they might share or use with their sexual partners. There were sort of four ideas that came out. Generally, the service providers found that like the factual information that they were giving stayed about the same, but they were more likely to give nuanced information and personal opinions when it came to talking to friends. So there was like, you know, there probably was some sort of standard of objective information that people were using, and then they added to that when they were like in more social environments. Some participants, though, felt that they treated everyone sort of the same, and that was a challenge for them, sort of disconnecting their personal and professional lives. So I think you can see the influence of one going in a certain direction there, right? The professional maybe being more visible to that person in their personal life. And lastly, service providers found that with the information they had, and the privileged access to information, it sort of made them responsible to challenge stigmatizing attitudes, and also just to help other gay guys in their community make good choices. And so there was like a sense of responsibility around it. So some quotes. These quotes are talking about how some of the information they provided was similar. So I'm going to move this a little bit closer. How PrEP works, it's the same regardless of whether you're talking to someone that you're working with or with a friend. Unfortunately, I treat it the same way because I have trouble letting go. I'm equally as intense with everybody, my sexual partners, my friends, and the people I meet at the clinic. So some of the ways that they found that information might be different. When it comes to clients, I'll never tell them what to do. When it comes to my friends, though, sometimes I will take that liberty of being like, listen, you should do this. When it comes to people I'm working with, I make sure they have the information they need to know to come to their own proper decisions. With a client, there's an ethical and legal element, so I tell myself I need to protect myself and not express my opinion too much. To a client, I might say something like, there are conflicting reports. To a friend or partner, I probably would be a bit more on the advocate side and say, well, the evidence is quite strong. The treatment has a very strong effect on transmission. So different sort of processing of information. I remember at this time too, like a lot of organizations hadn't really made any statements around any of the new information. So it was particularly difficult to know what was or what was not accurate. Gay service providers also described bringing insider perspectives to their work. So sometimes they referred to a practice of reflexivity as they describe the role that their own life experiences play in the kind of judgments they make and the advice they provide to their clients. So an example, there's been a few committees and stuff where I'm told, you need to be an objective gay man. I'm like, well, no, that's actually not my job. My job is to be a subjective gay man doing this job. I think that's definitely very important. We made promises to ourselves. I'll never do this again. If my test comes back negative, I promise to whatever God I will never bear back again. And then guess what? You go back into the same cycle. We can laugh at it now because we're slightly smarter maybe, but that's a good learning process as well. It's important to go through that stage, so that you don't become complacent, that you just become separate from the work that you do. Actually, I think that was it. Yeah. That's the end of our quotes. So.
Yeah, so you can have your own damn microphone. Thank you very much. So we did want to sort of share some of our thoughts, but before we do that, we just wanted to open it up to your reactions, thoughts about some of these findings from residents. Does any of it resonate? Any thoughts or reactions you'd like to share? Bravely go up to one of the microphones. I'd love to hear your thoughts about it.
Thanks for the quotes as a bit of a tool, because I think it sort of helped give us a better understanding of the perspective of the project. Something as a bit of a theme in the quotes stood out for me, in that we may not necessarily be talking about, sex in general. It seems like we might be talking about kinkier sex, and maybe how we judge or perceive our own kinks, whether we know that we have them or not. Hopefully we do. And then within that, sort of how we feel society might feel about kinky sex if we engage in that. So, I think society's come a long way in terms of same-sex sex, but I think there's some work to be done as it relates to kinkier sex, right? So that's what I got from the quotes, is that we're sort of maybe talking about kinkier sex in some ways. I don't know if anybody agrees with me or not.
Mm-hmm. I don't. First, I'm just going to put that out there. I think the guys were just talking about sex. So I guess it depends on, definitions of kinky sex, I suppose. But, there's references to barebacking, which I think was a bit less of an open discussion even just like 4 or 5 years ago when we did this. But I'm not sure I would put that in the category of kinky sex myself. Bareback sex is just sex for for straight people. So I don't, because I actually did all of the interviews. So I remember all of these conversations I had, and it was very rarely about sort of kinkier sex. It was just about sex for the guys in terms of how they talked about it. And maybe that is the way that they're talking about it may make it sound like they're talking about kinky sex, but they're actually talking about sex. And that may be a reflection of just maybe how the conversation has shifted a little bit over the last few years, particularly around discussions around undetectability and PrEP. As Len said, it's interesting in that context when this guy talked about struggling about what do I say, and am I conservative, do I give my opinion? It was very much at a time when I don't know that any organization in the country had yet said anything definitive about either PrEP or undetectability. This was pre-U equals U. I remember at the time doing a little tour of websites across the country, and not only not seeing any definitive statements, but hardly seeing any information about any of that on any of our websites. So it may be just a reflection of the shift, but I just want to assure you that, having done the interviews, the guys were just talking about sex in this context.
Great.
Yeah.
And I think I might feel that way because of maybe personal reactions
Absolutely.
I had from
Yeah.
people, and then I sort of would see that maybe coming into the quotes from my own
Yeah, absolutely.
people,
Yeah, one person's kink is another person's, casual Sunday afternoon. So it all depends on where you're coming from. Yeah.
Well, another thing too, maybe that might have resonated with you, was just how there's some really purposeful navigation around being thoughtful around what we're talking about, when it's being talked about, right? They're talking, a lot of these experiences are about what was happening, behind the curtain, and they're a little bit more candid kinds of comments. But there is a sense I feel that comes through from them, which is around there's an acknowledgement that some things are maybe a little bit more okay to say and more okay to talk about, and other things just are less okay. And with kink, that can often be the case, right? Depending on where you are, you may be more or less able to talk about what you like.
I think it comes back a bit to what Rahim was saying yesterday around shame and around what's private and what's secret. So all of those tensions that we have personally as well that play out in our professional lives. Mm-hmm. So we had Vincent and then Sue.
What really stood out for me, and maybe that should, I want to have your opinion about this, is how in a few of those, the problem is that, and that's very personal. I remember living in Montreal, working at Maison Plein Coeur, and not having benefits and having a very low salary and not being able to afford mental health or PrEP, and being able to send my clients go to Réseau and you have free counseling, and then I can't because the free counselors at Réseau are the people who have a beer after work with. So a lot of the quotes were oh, I wish I had access to that and I don't. And I remember the one quote about this worker coming up and saying like, I bear back and I party and blah, blah. And it seemed like nobody was asking like, do you need to talk about that actually? Like, it's okay. Like, I don't know. I think we need to find ways in our work to like have access to mental health more. And I don't know if some people were talking about that, because I didn't see a lot in the quote. I saw the lack of it in the quote, but not like the possibility to have access. When people in Toronto come and ask me like for free resources around gay men's health, I'm like, yeah, sure. But then when I need something, like, do I go see my colleague and be like, hey, can you check like that on my ass to see if it's syphilis? I don't know. I wouldn't, but I mean, it could, but I don't know that they could tell just by looking. It was just like inaccurate science joke. Anyway, I'm gonna stop talking, but this is my question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, yeah, one of the things that I would say is that, both the interviews with the gay service providers, but also just the focus groups with the service providers and the focus groups with the gay men, everyone talked about the lack of opportunities and spaces to talk about these issues. And so people were, like when we announced at the end of the focus groups with service providers that there would be this follow-up and we'd be doing a handful of interviews to talk about this dual role. I mean, in some groups, I almost had people like knocking over chairs to come to me, just like, please, I want to talk about this. Like there was a real need to, to talk about those exact issues, and people not seeing that space because it's all, we're colleagues. Like it's hard to have that conversation. Where do you go to talk about that? Yeah.
And just to build on what you're saying, and we're really interested in hearing how people navigate those difficulties, because it would be nice to identify some solutions that work for some people. And also it becomes sometimes even harder when you come from a smaller city, right? Because when it's a bigger city, you might have more resources and an easier way to not hide yourself, but find yourself around with people that might not know you, and for you to feel more comfortable accessing to those services. But in smaller cities, already you might be the only gay worker in your ASO, and already you don't have anyone to talk to about that. That might understand what you're going through, or these dual role tensions that you might be living. But then also accessing resources, you're just having the same difficulties that your participants are having, but with the difficulty that those might be the partners that you are having around your networking, your table, right? Your partnership round table or something. So those are definitely things we leave in our field.
Thank you. Kim Kinnican from the Men's Health Initiative in Kelowna, BC. Perfect segue to my question, because coming from a more smaller urban and rural and remote areas, that's one of the issues that comes up a lot. Is when I even researched the project when I started working in Kelowna, was interviewing the folks that had done the position previous to me. And the biggest thing was this burnout of the professional and personal, and being the one program that's providing the support services and dealing with stigma and isolation. Then the person who's the one person providing that, where do they get that support? Being in an isolated place with very limited resources. So I really like the focus of being able to highlight this. And I was just kind of wondering, was there any conversations in the work you did about what were some of the solutions of some ways we could provide more support for our peer frontline workers to be able to maintain and retain them? Because I know a conversation I've had with Jonathan on AVI before is like, how do we retain people in these positions in rural remote areas when they're feeling burnt out, they're doing great work, and then they're like, yeah, I've had enough because I can only turn my hat back and forth so many times between professional and personal. Was there feedback on that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
So I know something that works in Ontario is there's the Gay Men's Sexual Health Alliance, and they have at least 3 to 4 meetings a year. And for a lot of the guys doing gay men's work in Ontario, coming to those spaces, not only to receive the training, but really more that support with other peers doing the kind of the same work that guys are doing in different places in Ontario, that's a huge support already for guys that might not have that opportunity to talk to just the desk next door, right? So already those kinds of spaces are useful. It might not be possible everywhere because of the big country we're at and the distances. So I guess exploring some online opportunities. For some people, some kind of Facebook groups have been helpful. That was certainly useful during the prep first months. So, but we'd be happy to hear what works for other people as well. I don't know, Len, Marc-André, do you have other?
No, I was going to say the same thing. I'd love to hear what people think might be good good solutions, because it is a very real problem. And some of the conversations that we had a series of, 12 conference calls between the three of us and Ed Jackson, who worked at Katie at the time, grappling with this particular theme. We had some great conversations. One of the things that we highlighted was the issue that you raised, and also just sort of from a historical perspective that, so many times the people hired to do prevention work with gay men are hired under the qualification that they're gay men, as if this comes with a whole set of skill set that because you're a gay man, you know how a bathhouse works, you know exactly where to find guys in your community, that you already, that you don't need additional sort of supports and training and encadrement, as we say in French, but and that's been the case for many years. I mean, Ed talked about how, even in the early days up until today, that seems to be happening a lot in organization. And as Roberto and you were saying, if you're in an organization or in a community where you're sort of the only game/gay in town doing this work, it's even more isolating. So I think, thinking a little more critically about, I guess not just gay men, but any situation where you're working within your own community and you're hired because you're a member of that community. I guess it's just for organizations to be aware of that assumption that we sometimes make, that just because you're a member of that community, you know the ins and outs of everything, how it works, and that's not always the case, right?
It can be just the opposite almost.
Yeah.
Two comments that I sort of were, two ideas and thoughts that came to mind, Kim. One is, I think that organizational context is a really important factor. I just today, well, not today, yesterday, I guess, at the summit, met someone from out east who was saying that when he had been doing HIV prevention work with gay guys in the mid-2000s, his role was to do education. But when he actually tried to go out to bars to do actual outreach, that was seen as contravening some policy, and he was fired from his job because he was actually going to his community, right? And so a lot of the time, there's as Marc-André was saying, and this has been some of my experiences, you're hired on and you're asked to do a specific job because it is important to bring lived experience to that role. You can't really do that role without some kind of lived experience. But then if the organizational culture isn't one where people can actually bring themselves to their work and be sexual people, be flawed people, then it creates this this sort of impossible situation where you are supposed to the point of you being there is to bring your lived experience to the job, but you actually then can't because that's not professional or that intersects with what you're supposed to be saying, right? So an organizational culture that's more prescriptive in terms of the work that staff do and how they communicate about certain things is going to make it more challenging. And just sort of more a second thought around burnout. That's something that is, I've definitely seen, and that's been talked about ever since I started working in the sector. It's probably been happening for a long time in HIV in general. I guess two points on that is one, I wonder if outreach work and community educators, we have paid they're paid well enough in order to for it to be something that we would actually want people to stay in for a long time. It might not be good for people to stay in those roles unless they're paid better money, I think. But also I think one of the challenges is that often there aren't really opportunities to advance professionally, right? It's you're an outreach worker, you're going to be in community, and that's all the options and opportunities there are for you. It's not there are opportunities in a lot of organizations to have a more advanced position doing that kind of work, right? There is and the sector is growing, but the opportunities are really rare to like actually continue in the sector. So I don't know if burnout is something that like, you know, without some major changes we can really stop. But yeah, I'm curious.
Thank you so much. From some of the ways that some folks were talking about making choices around sex, it sounded like they were shaming themselves for having risky sex. And I think it's really important for us to normalize having the sex that we want to have as long as we're modeling consent and communication. And I work as a substitute teacher, and for Halloween I wore a red panda onesie, and one of the middle school students asked if I was a furry. And I don't want to be sex shamey, and at the same time, like, want to be able to be sex positive and not compromise my employment. And it's interesting because I would consider myself some sort of queer service provider, even though that's technically not in my job responsibility for the person that I am. I think that's responsibility that I have. But yeah, it's just very difficult to navigate, especially when working with youth, but I guess differently when working with people of the same age. And I hope that we can support people who are providing services to adults to feel comfortable being sexual and doing that the way that they want to, not the way that some straight people think we should be. Yeah.
Thank you.
You said something that really resonated with me, which is why we chose that title for this research project, which is just like, who are you when you are at work first? Like, and I have like a while ago came to a realization that when I was studying public health, or when I was in like a particular job, that I was actually like, I'm a queer person first who's doing a particular kind of work. So I'm a queer person who might be working within public health to like, you know, use some of that discipline's tools to like better my community, but I come as a queer person. But other people, like, I think maybe have different relationships to their career and define themselves more based on their career. Like, I'm a public health professional and happen to be queer. And that is like, I think, an important distinction and just a helpful one to think about as a queer service provider, is like, who are you most accountable to, and like what part of your identity do you feel like most aligned with? So thanks for that comment.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, so I think it's like, if it's tricky, but I think if people see us as sexual people and people who are part of the community, I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that like it can be awkward at first, but I think to normalize that everybody who wants to have sex, like, hopefully can find people that want to enthusiastically participate with them, and that people who have paid employment related to queer or gay sexuality shouldn't be excluded from that, and hopefully we can normalize that together.
Yeah, no, I agree. Can I just add one more thing? So there was a really interesting conversation that I just happened to be like witness to about 10 years ago, and it was through the GMSH in Ontario. And the conversation was about like, what is a sex-positive work environment, and what's a sex-positive organization? Because that's sort of, it's a complicated question to ask. I mean, like, obviously, and there's like many different ways you could interpret it. But one of the like takeaways that I took that I thought was helpful was that the idea that in a sex-positive work environment, it should be hopefully okay for someone to like express and be sexual, like about themselves, and talk about their own sexual reality. But where there was a struggle, where it might not be a sex-positive environment, or where sex positivity wasn't, was sort of projecting that onto others, or incorporating others into one's like sexual experience or story, or sexualizing others. Right, so like sex-positive environments are about me and being able to express myself, but not necessarily like impose that on someone. And I think that's a helpful lens to think about in terms of how we can encourage sex positivity in our own workplaces. Thanks.
Yeah, and another point that you made it just made me want to do a bit of a plug, but you mentioned about how it sounded like some guys were sort of shaming themselves for the kinds of sex they have or for being sexual, being in the context of their work of also being a service provider, educator. And yes, I think that did happen on occasion. Certainly a lot of conflicted feelings about that and trying to navigate what that means, for sure. There was also, I would say, judgments from one service provider to another. And one of the quotes, I'm sure you caught it, but very heavily talked about that quite directly.
Was it I party, I bear back?
Yeah, yeah. That's
So,
an interesting one, yeah.
by the way, I just wanted to add, so that quote was actually like an AIDS Action Now poster, and the last line, which wasn't included in the quote, was, maybe the person didn't say it in the quote, was, "I'm responsible."
Yeah.
And so that, I think that's what was, for some people contentious, is that like they felt that was so impossible that you couldn't say those things together. I party, I bear back. I'm HIV positive, I'm responsible. That's what partly was really interesting about the response, and I guess the purpose of the art.
And the fact that line is not in the quote as well is kind of interesting. But I highlight that, and it made me think. So we have a few copies of the handouts of this particular set of data from the Resonance Project, but we also have, it's one of many themes that we have. We have project summary, but it made me also think of, this is like section 9 of the report, it made me think of section 7 and 8. So there were themes, and this was both the gay men in the focus groups and the service providers, but talking about the themes of trust and deception is a fascinating one that I encourage you to read, and the one about responsibility. So what is it to be a good gay citizen? So those are very interesting themes that would have been great to have time to get into, but I encourage you to go there. And actually, can you just click on the last slide for a minute? We're not done, but I just wanted to put up the link to where you can find these. You can get the full report from it or the individual by theme findings. But I would encourage you to look at that because there is some fascinating shit around trust and deception and responsibility that we found in those discussions that are worth looking at. Yeah.
And just to build on that and around the shame for having a risky sex is sometimes having the access to the information. So guys knew what the right information was, but the whoever was making decisions or deciding the statements for the organizations, that could have been executive directors or boards, was very slow to keep up with that information. So that also contributed to that personal shame, but also the way they worked with other guys into guys in the community, right? Because they would have to keep still like the condom-only discourse when they knew there was more information and more options available. So they kind of were this and sort of encouraging distrust or discouraging trust because they didn't feel that support yet. So it was kind of like a liability response to make sure that professionally they were okay with their work, but personally they were comfortable enough to have that risky sex. But so that's a slow response in the sector as well had that impact in the lives of the gay service providers.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys, Darren Lauscher, Vancouver. It triggered so many things, and as a gay positive man who's also has the hat as a senior level volunteer, we go through all of this shit and then more because we don't have any benefits as a volunteer. Agencies quite often do have healthcare plans that do have a component of counseling, good or bad. But as a volunteer, you've got nothing. And what I get back is, well, you're a member, you can access the counselor. Well, you can't. You hold too many private confidential pieces, so you can't actually access your organization and or other organizations. So it's a real double-edged sword, which would be interesting to do a piece of research on for senior level. And another component, which I find really interesting, is you will be having sex with somebody who is employed, at an agency who has all the same education. And as you're getting down to the down and dirty, gazing into the eyes, their mouth will open. You think, oh, there's going to be a lovely little something here. And they go, you will keep me safe, won't you? And you just go like, fuck. We sit through the same education. And you pull this. So it's really an interesting piece as a volunteer.
Thanks. Thank you for sharing that. And that came up in particular in the focus groups with gay men, but also in the service providers. And we discussed it, I think, under responsibility, was that extra burden that people who are living with HIV felt to be educators with their sexual partners. So when you compound that with being a service provider, an HIV positive service provider, who also talked about that burden, right? That difficulty to disconnect, like in the moment, you know, and I recall many times, like chatting online with someone and then they have a question, all of a sudden, like I'm practically, like I remember literally on Squirt, sending people links to like PowerPoint presentations online and like fact sheets and stuff. So I'm like, what am I doing? Like, you know, but it's hard, right? You feel that burden of responsibility, and positive guys talked about that very eloquently as well as you know, being very willing to share information because they have it, but also sometimes it's like, okay, like really, I just want to fuck, like, can I turn it off at some point? And that feeling, that burden that others impose as well.
It's a burden in that bigger picture, but it's a burden within a core group of guys who actually have the
Right.
And you go like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah.
Like, did you just become stupid?
Yeah. Hello.
Hi, guys. I'm not just bending over this whole time. I'm Aaron, Health Initiative for Men. Kind of following up on my colleagues' points, and I really love the Resonance Project, and I think that it's the beginnings of a conversation around working with our peer programs, because it's kind of resoundingly kind of amongst all of us known that like we want to be doing this work for our communities. And we also know that it's kind of what I'm seeing in a lot of the quotes and a lot of what my colleagues are presenting and in the form of questions is a very, very unique stress. Things that one might not have to think about if one was to, you know, do a Bachelor of Social Work and possibly, you know, get a job in some hospital ward that didn't have anything to do with something that you've experienced personally. You don't have to think about being in a sex-positive environment. You just have the sex that you have, and that's fine. You don't have to bring your queerness forward, as Len was saying, because you're just in society. So there's all these unique stressors. And within this endemics model of understanding HIV, there's this chunk of stuff, this mental health side of things that I find is like chronically underaddressed. And kind of poorly understood, even for doing the work in community, let alone doing it with our own organizations. So I think this work is a really, really powerful, great start, because what you can see within the quotes is these unique considerations that like other staff and other organizations would never have to make. So I do think that it's incredibly important that any leadership within any of our organizations, CBRC, MAX, researchers, all of these things, we have consideration on the well-being of our staff, not just being able to talk about sex, maybe being able to not talk about sex, maybe validation of bisexual folks amongst our work, maybe asexual people, maybe having conversations that matter to those people. I think that some of the newer staff at HIM get annoyed sometimes, maybe, I hope not, but that I'm often checking in with them saying, how are you doing? How are you managing the stress of this? This is a lot, because we're at a time where we're moving forward past having like 30 people in gay men's health in Canada. Then there were 60, then there were 90. And now we're kind of like, there's a new generation coming in. And it's not getting less stressful. it's not, because it's getting more stressful. So I think this is a really good starting point, and I guess I don't think I have a question. Mine is more of just a comment about taking care of our volunteers, making sure they have priority access to counseling. At HIM, sometimes we actually don't have the counselors mingle with the other volunteers because they need to be able to help the volunteers that we have. We have 120 volunteers active at any one time. So really honoring this work and always calling out for the meaningful attention to the syndemics model and the disproportionate weight that seems to be focused on the sexual risk-taking behaviors side of a 4-point model, I think is my constant critique, made with love and affection for the work that's been done here. So, thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I was hoping you were gonna come up to speak, because the work that him is doing with peers that do that kind of like also mental health support to the community. So these are the same realities that they might live as well. So like you're saying, we're more and more, and these realities are just more people living them now. And I think we hear from our communities, at least we do a lot at Max in Ottawa, like guys want to have more gay service providers, right? They want to go to gay doctors, they want to go to gay dentists, like, because just who we are is so connected to our health in every single aspect that it's just, we feel better when we can talk to someone that will understand who we are. But then these service providers that for now, even if they're gay and they might be serving gay, they're keeping the gay separate. And we're asking for them not to, but then we have to start, to keep thinking, because we are thinking, what are the supports that we're going to provide to all these new and highly demanded generation of gay service providers using their gay when service providing.
Yeah, I think that, just to follow up on that, when you've seen staff come in, working in these peer settings, and within 6 months they've relapsed themselves, or they have gotten so stressed out that they can no longer have sex. Like these are things that I've seen, and so it's a very delicate balance. And I think that there's some of us, I'm naming myself in the so-called core, that have an even greater responsibility to think about these nuances and really be responsible around thinking beyond sex, like truly a kind of holistic consideration of these things. And it's not easy. It's not, because there's no kind of like options, like clear-cut options for mental health and the consideration of people's loneliness or stress at work. But there are some good practices that we can probably embody, which I know most of us are, but still a thing.
Yeah, and thank you to you and Darren and Kim for sort of calling for a broadening of this kind of approach as well. I mean, I think this project, we were very much focused on the sort of how was emerging biomedical knowledge circulating, because it was a particular moment in our history, and that was the lens. But it's also a reflection of how so much of the research looking into gay men's health has been through the lens of HIV over the years. I think it would be super interesting to repeat this kind of project, but to address some of those issues that you raised, to think much more broadly, obviously, than HIV, to a more holistic health approach, to look at not just paid but volunteer work, to look at larger and smaller centers, to look at not just sort of what are the issues that people are struggling with, but maybe some implementation science and program science around what are some of the solutions and what are some of the tools that we could provide to both the workers and the organizations to support this work a bit more. I think that would be a fascinating project to look into, because I think it does sort of give us a glimpse at some issues that I find really interesting that 3 or 4 years after we did this are still resonating with you in the room who are working in this field. So I think it's something that would be great to continue and expand. Let's do it.
Cool.
Resonance 2, Electric Boogaloo. Awesome.
Yeah. So to speak to that too, and just maybe reflect, like I think that there is there's a type of narrative that this sort of small part of a big research project really tapped into around being what you do, and doing working on yourself but also your community. It's just it's a pressure cooker. It's a really challenging kind of job to have, and I think that that idea can be expanded beyond gay men and gay men's outreach workers, but to other ways that people work within their community and sort of bring their identity or not to their work within their communies. I think that there is a particular narrative with gay men's outreach workers and just how the component around sex becomes such a core part of it. There is a pressure to bring oneself, I feel, to the work in a way that I know other queer service providers who go to work as queer people but don't have to directly work on the thing that is for me was one of the organizing factors. HIV was a huge thing when I came out and moved to Toronto in 2000. So, and so this research also led to, we wanted to publish an article, this possibly a little bit of a transition, but one of the things that we did after all of this great, summarizing was done by Marc-André and San, was to go to the literature and sort of review and try to find examples in academic literature of I don't know, similar kinds of narratives around having a dual role or being what you do. And it was pretty interesting because there was almost nothing to capture this particular kind of experience. There was psychologists that work in small communities, but it just it just wasn't quite the same kind of experience. But I think the reason that we wanted to continue the conversations was because it had been such an important aspect, at least of my experience, of doing the work and I have for a long time was and am sort of one of these people, right? I was doing testing for 10 years, at SPOCSS, and talking to guys about risk. I mean, in those days, there wasn't a truth that was it was really hard to for instance talk about what you wanted to do sexually, because it didn't really matter as much because there was one option for prevention, which was condoms, and you just sort of had to force yourself to do whatever I felt this way, do whatever mental gymnastics you needed to in order to be able to use condoms. And so some truths almost couldn't be spoken because as important as they were, there just wasn't many options, right? When PrEP happened, I think that was the start of a whole different kind of way that we've started talking about sex within the workplace. That actually is starting to more allow for things like pleasure to be a question and to acknowledge a little bit more of a humanity. Yeah, I just rambled a little bit there.
Thank you. This subject is fascinating and very relevant, so I could talk about it all day. Mm-hmm. One thing that it's not really a question, but it just keep popping to my mind. Yesterday I was talking with two guys that are at this conference who unfortunately just ended long-term relationship. And I think this is something we don't talk about a lot. And I remember a few years ago when I did the work and I went from being in my long-term relationship to being single, nobody sort of told me by the way, your relationship with your communities is going to change now that you're single. Because there was, while I was with my ex, I was having good sex because I was having the sex with my cute boyfriend, with our dog and blah, blah. And now that I'm single, I'm having bad sex because, which I don't. But it was this image, and it really, I think it's a conversation that we need to have when somebody there's a major event that changed and it's just not there. So if there's more research based on that, I'm with Aaron. It's gonna help you too. So I don't think it's a question, but talk about it.
One of the things that this work has forced me to do is like get closer and closer towards some kind of authenticity towards myself. Like, I just like could not like, talk to so many people for so long around their relationship to sex and HIV and sexual health and their sexual orientation and their gender identity if I hadn't figured out my questions, like around HIV and fear of HIV, right? Like is a big one. Like doing, like I had so many HIV tests, and like every time, there is sort of like an internal process of like, what like the way that you give an HIV test, I think often is reflective of how you feel about HIV, right? And what you think, like if you're positive or negative, but like whether you are afraid of getting HIV or not, and that comes through in the way that you talk and communicate with clients. So I've felt like I had to answer a lot of those questions, right? And there really was nobody to tell me a lot of those things, because like I was in the role, that particular place that forced me to ask those particular questions. And so I try to continue, I bring authenticity as much as I can to my work and my presence professionally, and I try to encourage other people to do the same, because the story that you just shared, there isn't probably that many people to share that particular story except for you, and you sharing it has might have, this is a small room, but might have helped someone think through, okay, this is, this isn't such a unique narrative, it's just that it takes a person every once in a while to have this particular kind of experience and then talk about it for us to bring it to light and sort of learn from it. So thank you for sharing.
One of the things that we wanted to do was to, in both sort of presenting these findings, but in the discussions that Len mentioned that we had around potentially publishing an article, which we haven't given up, but it's been on the back burner now for 2 years, because it is a sort of unique project. When we did the literature search for other similar projects, it's true, there was very little that we found. I mean, those were some of the closest examples, or women working in domestic violence who had themselves experienced domestic violence, but it's not quite the same thing. And in particular, the fact that we're dealing with sex makes it a particularly complex issue to grapple with. And that blurring of the line between the professional and the personal, we saw lots of codes of ethics for social workers and doctors and psychologists about, basically tells you don't sleep with your clients. But it's not the kinds of nuanced conversations that we're having around how that works. But one of the things that we wanted to do was to honor those of us who've been working in this field, who are gay men ourselves. And what we realized is that at a time when the sort of orthodoxy about what HIV prevention was rapidly shifting. And I mean, we're sort of seeing in which direction it's gone at this point, and is still shifting. But at that time, it was very uncertain what was going to happen with all this information coming out about PrEP and undetectability, and how it was going to shape all of our lives and the way that we interact with each other through sex and other ways, and impacts on stigma and relationships and dating and all of that. But what we realized is that because of the privileged access that we had to this information, we were essentially the first ones to do it, to test it out. So we had this phrase of embodying the new orthodoxy. And we very much purposefully chose the concept of embodiment, because those of us working in this field, who are gay men, were in our own bodies really testing out and creating this new orthodoxy about what HIV prevention and sex and risk and relationship was all about. And we wanted to honor that because we really did. Like our community did sort of embody this new orthodoxy. We talked about having that educator role that we had, but I mean, we tested it out. We tested out the boundaries, right, about what it meant and how we could relate to each other in a different way. But we do that all the time. It's an ongoing process, right? Because we're always with the privileged access to this information. And so I'm sure other members in our community probably saw on some of our profiles for the first time the word undetectable, the U equals U, the plus in bracket sign, the equal sign in bracket sign, the word prep, like all of these things probably popped up on a lot of our own profiles, at least as early as some of the other guys in the community. So we just wanted to sort of honor that. It's complicated, but it's also kind of amazing that, you know, we are at that forefront, and I think like literally through our bodies, we are embodying what this new orthodoxy is in this field. So I just wanted to highlight that and sort of, you know, high five everyone for doing that and just recognize and honor that.
Yeah, well, I think that's like a sort of almost an element of like the HIV in the story, an elephant of HIV, yeah, an element of HIV/AIDS, like, and the story has been one of like embodiment, like around treatment advocacy and, you know, like the earlier treatments that existed and how like really like, you know, people put their bodies on the line. You know, I always think it's interesting to go to the CAR conference and to like the basic science presentations, like where they're just talking about all sorts of things, like except for the fact that like whose bodies they got like the tissues from that they did their research on, right? Like, and often they'll be like, thank you Maple Leaf Clinic, which is like in Toronto and is largely like HIV positive gay men, you know, but. And so we give like of our bodies, like it's a very embodied kind of experience. And yeah, and like, well, condoms is like another sort of example of like just having to do it, right? Like you just have to figure it out. Nobody like, and that's one of the things that I think is interesting about all these transitions was like, you know, a lot of, I think maybe one of the challenges that the sector had around figuring out what to do with this information was reflective of the fact that maybe a lot of the people who were responsible for deciding what language to use and what the responsible choice would be, they might not have actually had the lived positionality to know how to answer that question. Like, you can only answer that question by having to answer it, like, and just doing it, right? Which was my experience with like pre-exposure prophylaxis. Like I exited quite a bit before it was like ever sort of like put into any formal policy in Canada, like partly because I knew that like I was just hearing so many conversations from people just saying like they were really sex negative and like sort of like homophobic around, oh, like, you know, what this is going to lead to, all those things that many of us have probably heard and thought about or thought of or like, you know, thought around. It was like that's all that I was hearing in the context, and so like for me it was like I felt like under an incredible amount of pressure not to get HIV, like, and every year that went by that pressure got like more and more extreme because I was supposed to be more and more of an expert in the field, right? And like I have a friend who, you know, as in a related note, was told by an ED once that if he got HIV as the gay men's outreach worker, that he would have to be fired, right? Because like, how could you do HIV prevention if you can't prevent your own HIV? Like, you know, I don't think that was such a unique experience or a unique fear for a long time. And, you know, it highlights some of these like little fault lines in the sector where like things don't maybe line up just perfectly. I mean, and this really came up yesterday too around HIV, like serophobia, right? And I think there's a lot of sort of resonance again with the conversation that was had yesterday around like people living with HIV being like a core component of the sector and why that's important. It's like a very similar kind of thing. It's like, you know, you can't really know these things unless you are them or have to do them.
Very quickly, as far as the mental health is to speak of perhaps pride in the profession and instead of stereotypes, role models in profession. Those are just two concepts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it goes back to sort of what I was saying earlier about sort of honoring the ways that many people in this sector have sort of embodied this new orthodoxy, and some people have grappled and have a lot of self-reflexivity about what it means to work in this field and to be a gay man at the same time. And I think it's, you know, great in terms of role models, but to hear about not just what some of those questions and struggles are, but how people sort of square that in their personal and professional lives.
Thanks for saying serophobia, Len. I was starting to get worried we might go through the whole session without saying that. And I think we had a really great conversation that I learned a lot. I mean, I was part of the panel, but I also learned a lot in the conversation we had yesterday about serophobia. And in thinking a little bit about the connection between serophobia and mental health, knowing that there's folks in the room who might have been featured in those quotes, and that there's also folks in the room who know a lot more about mental health than I do. But I couldn't help but cover my face when I heard what you just said, Len, about an ED telling someone that they had to stay HIV negative to do prevention work. It's one of the reasons we don't say prevention. We try not to say prevention at Youth Co. It's one of the reasons that we have the JIPA and MIPA principles, and I think it was I think if you continue to develop an article out of this, or as you present this work in the future, thinking about, like, there's some serophobia in some of those quotes, I think, and so maybe front-ending that, or making that a more, like, including that in the analysis as it's presented, I think would be really helpful, and I'm really glad that it came up. But I think about the connection between serophobia and mental health for people living with HIV and for people that are HIV negative. And I think, Len, like for all of you on the panel, but Len and I have had a little bit more of these conversations. I've learned a lot from you about what it means to work through the fear around seroconversion and how we can talk about that in ways that are affirming of all people's experiences, and would like to see our mental health and our sexual health work create more space for that. So thank you, and I'm glad we said serophobia.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah.
And just to build on that, because the serophobia, I think, not only in this section, but across the findings of resonance was very much present.
Palpable.
And I think it comes with, you know, as we all know, it's also very political and social and cultural, right? For some people, the fear working with immigrants, for example, the fear of getting HIV more than really the HIV is the fear of being sent back to the country, right? Not being able to stay. So I think as we are fighting as well in the sector, serophobia, it has to be through all of those lenses. I'm sure, I was unfortunately not there at the conversation yesterday, but I'm sure it was around all of those factors that build into the serophobia that still today, having such great treatment, there's still so much present everywhere and still in the sector.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking a lot about yesterday, and you know, I think that I'm so glad that conversation happened yesterday. Thank you for mediating that conversation. Was like, so as I've been doing HIV testing for 10 years, like I picked up on this very particular challenge, which is around, and like the best way that the best term that I can put to it is like a HIV testing like narrative zero divide. So basically, like the experience of like seeing other testers, and from that particular lens, it's like you see the message being given to HIV negative folks that like it's really important that they stay HIV negative. Like it's not only is it really important, it's like probably the most important thing that they should be thinking about whenever they make like decisions about the sex they're having. Like, and that actually really, you see that work all the way up into like logic models of like, you know, of provincial bodies. Like, you know, the AIDS Bureau, I think pretty sure their end, like the most important end goal is to prevent HIV transmissions, right? And, but when in that sort of space, the HIV testing space, like, you know, you're giving all this sort of like, don't get HIV messaging, but then as soon as someone tests positive, it's like a completely different narrative. It's like, oh, everything's gonna be fine. This is like a chronic illness. It's totally manageable. We'll get you right to your doctor. Like there's a big community. Like there's tons of services available for you. Like, you know, some like this might even be a relief for you. Like this is, you know, like, and it's just completely different. But if that person tests negative, it's like, great, now keep on not getting HIV, right? And that actually, like, creates this huge burden, like, on HIV negative guys, like, and is like it contributes to the burden that HIV places on our communities. So that's one of the things that I've like really taken to heart in terms of how I talk about and do my work is like, I'm not, like, my personal goal is not HIV prevention or to prevent HIV transmissions, because I want to make sure that everyone is okay, like, despite getting HIV. Like, if someone gets HIV, they have to be okay too, right? So, like, preventing HIV can't be my main goal, but, like, reducing the burden that it places on all of us by things like addressing serophobia, by questioning, like, some of these sort of assumptions that are inherent and built into our work. Yeah, I once told that, like, to like a pretty high public official in Ontario over beers, and he said, I can't believe you would ever say that. Like, you know, you should not be working in this field if you think that. Like, these are, you know, don't seem to be like such intense ideas, but so interesting to see, like, you know, the changing times.
All right. Looks like we're at our time. Any last questions, comments, observations?
If you want to challenge serophobia this weekend at the conference, you can sign the national statement to end criminalization of HIV non-disclosure that the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network put out. And if you don't know where to find that, I'm so happy to talk about it. So call me anytime.
And there's also going around one petition to sign to avoid asking for HIV tests for people who are asking to immigrate to Canada.
Also, if anyone is interested in kind of some more work that's being done and explored around this notion of peer engagement, I'm going to shout out to Sarah Chown for sending me the article on something called healing-centered care. I can't find the article right now, but as soon as I'm out of this room, which is a Wi-Fi dead zone, I will be able to tell you who wrote that article, but look up healing-centered care. It's about, it's from a Black author who's talking about Black service workers supporting Black youth, and also having conversations about how the service workers' healing is part of the healing of the community. So it's a very good article if you're curious. Healing-centered care. Do you remember the author? Okay, that's okay. We don't remember the author.
But you can also talk to me about that, so.
Also, to quote an AIDS Action Now poster from maybe like 5 years ago, like, you know, fuck positive people.
Fuck pause, guys. Well, thank you for being such an engaged audience. We have a few, if people still like paper, a few paper copies of the findings from Dual Role, or you can go to that webpage to look at those findings and all the other ones, and come see us to continue the conversation. Thank you.